Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Brennan. I'm a solution architect with EPAM Systems and a 3-time Sitecore Commerce MVP. Today, we're going to run through the ins and outs of creating plugins for Sitecore Experience Commerce. When I first started writing code with the Commerce engine, I just finished a number of Sitecore Commerce projects. I felt confident that I was going to be able to write my code quickly and easily. But guess what? I was wrong. I was writing a control to add items to a wish list, something I'd actually done many times before, and I couldn't quite figure out why everything wasn't working and why everything wasn't working together. And then I checked my configs. In previous versions of Sitecore Commerce, wish lists were configured by using named carts. However, now carts had transitioned to the cart plugin and the functionality hadn't been carried over. Today, we're going to run through that wishlist plugin, which doesn't use named carts, and use it as an example to create and explain the different classes, interfaces, and extension points available within the Commerce framework. This isn't your grandfather's Sitecore, or really the Sitecore we know and work with today. We're talking pipelines, commands, and models, and whilst the verbs are the same, the approach to writing them is a bit different. So let's get started with the Commerce engine, what it is and what it isn't. Essentially, it's a small, lightweight container that hosts functionality supplied through microservices. On its own, the functionality is limited. It doesn't really do a whole lot from an e-commerce perspective, except it allows us to do everything. Oh yeah, and it's also written in .NET Core. Like I mentioned, the Commerce engine is a container that hosts functionality we add through plugins. These are some of the plugins that we've got. Carts, guess what? It's a plugin. Orders, it's also a plugin. Pricing, another plugin. Tax, a plugin. As you can see, everything's a plugin. The benefit to this is that everything follows the same patterns and extension points that we're going to discuss today. Existing functionality can be modified and extended using the same concepts. No hacking, no copying and pasting decompiled code, or breaking out at the cold sweat at the thought of doing an upgrade. Okay, there's still just a little bit of that. The other cool thing is that we can distribute and share plugins through NuGet. You don't need to modify the source, you just need to reference the package, add it into your project, and then configure the extension points where you need to customize it. So, what is a plugin? A plugin is a small reusable module that creates or extends functionality within the Sitecore Experience Commerce platform. We can distribute them through NuGet, and we can also depend on other plugins being installed in the system. So, a plugin that adds an extra feature to a cart line needs to rely on the cart plugin being installed. So a plugin can install one or more of the following things. It can have entities, pipelines, and that includes pipeline blocks and pipeline arguments, commands, components, controllers, models, and policies. There's a lot of different things that can form a plugin. And this is about how we make them all work together and what that actually means for our e-commerce system as a whole. So now let's take a look at the code. We're going to start out looking at entities, components, and models. So entities are an object that inherit from Commerce entity. It's a single object that is serialized and stored within the system. A component then inherits components and can be used to extend the entity. If we want to add additional properties, lists, functionality to the entity, we can use a component, which means we're not inheriting the entity and then having to wire up a different class within the plugin. Then we've got models. They once again inherit from model, and they're a basic object that's used to extend entities or components. What we can also use them for is to present data within a command response and return a slightly abstracted result to the rest of our code that doesn't include all of the information within the entity or component. So we're going to take a look at some example code from some of our entities. We've got here our wish list, which has lines and also a list of components. And along there, we've got a few other properties. We've got our shop name, the number of items within our wish list, and then the lines that contain part of that wish list. The lines here are components, which we use to extend the entity. And we can see our wish list line component here. It's quite simple. All we've got there is an ID amongst it for the line and also the ID of the item that we're adding. On top of that, we've got a model here for the return result of our wishlist line. So what we're actually going to do in our future kind of steps where we process the information, we're going to return this model result rather than returning the entire wish list or line that we have. So what makes all of these things with entities actually come together? With our entities, components, and arguments. We're going to start using them within pipelines. So here we're going to talk about pipelines first, then the arguments, then the blocks. And then we're going to look at how they flow together and what it actually means to have all three. So our pipeline is essentially just a container and a definition for executing steps. It's much like our pipelines that we use today within the Sitecore Experience platform, and it's a definition of a pipeline. It's not logic. They're actually quite empty, as we'll see in the next screen, and sometimes you sort of wonder why. But all it's doing is creating that point that we can start to wire up additional steps within it. Our pipeline arguments are an object that we use as the input to the pipeline. So this is defined within the pipeline, and we can predict what we're actually going to see as our input, and we know our output as well, helping us to actually inject additional steps that are executed as part of the pipeline. Now, our pipeline blocks are the part that actually executes a functionality. So we can wire a pipeline block into a pipeline in a specific order to execute a series of actions that occur as part of the pipeline. So this is our diagram for it here. We have our pipeline, and then that executes blocks sequentially. We'll take a look at how we define the steps and the order that they occur in the pipeline once we finish developing the rest of our code. This is our pipeline for Get Wishlist. As I said, it's kind of empty. All we're doing here is we're defining that it's a commerce pipeline, that we're using our resolve wishlist argument as our argument, as our input, and wishlist is expected to be our output. So for here, we're going to take a look at our argument, which we see contains our shop name, our shopper name, and our wishlist ID. What that means is we're going to get a specific wish list for a specific person in a specific shop. You'll see here that we're using string length to define shop name. That's just to keep it consistent with some of the other plugins that we have. Okay. Then we've got our get wish list block. We've got a couple of little dots in the actual execute here, and we're going to look at that code on the next screen. This is pretty much just showing us our definition of the block. We've got the same resolve wish list argument. And once again, the wish list is going to be our output. And we're also using and injecting the find entity pipeline, which is a commerce core pipeline that we can use to predictably find our entities. And this is our code that actually executes within the run block. When our pipeline block runs, we run method, which kind of makes sense in that part. So we're first looking in our commerce context to see if we've already loaded the object or if it's perhaps just sitting in memory and hasn't been persisted. We will then return that object if that's the case. Otherwise, we're going to run the find entity pipeline. If we have it, we'll return that. Otherwise, we're going to create a new wish list and return that to the user. So now we're going to take a look at our commands, command controllers, and policies. Now this is how we start to get everything to come together again. Our command is a request to perform an action. What our commands normally do is execute a pipeline. Our command controller defines a route that we use to call our commands, and also it allows us to interact with the plugin using the OData protocol. We then have policies, which define the behavior of a plugin. Now, a note on policies is that they aren't meant to contain information that changes very often. So they are heavily cached, and we cache them using a step that we'll describe further on, as it's one of the later ones once we're starting to deploy our code. Okay, this is our command. So what we're doing here is, this is once again a definition. We're injecting our get wishlist pipeline, and then we're going to execute the pipeline action, which will in turn call the blocks, and we'll slowly get that information through the system. Well, not slowly. So this is the actual block that we're using to execute it. We're resolving our arguments, and then we're calling our method and executing that pipeline as well. Now these methods are asynchronous methods, so you'll see that we're using await and waiting for our response, and returning our wish list once we get it. Now, our next step here is to actually wire that all together in a way that we can access it through the OData protocol. So This one's a little bit different. Following the convention that we have on carts, we've got two controllers, two commerce controllers that we use. This is our first one that we're actually using to execute just the get method. So we can have that at API/wishlists. So all we're doing through this one is actually calling our get wishlist command. So we will see that once again, after we validated that our model state is valid, we're calling our command and returning the response where we should. The next thing, now that we've got our entities, we've got our components, we've got our models, we've got our pipeline definitions, we've got our pipeline arguments, our pipeline blocks, our commands, and we've wired them up using a command controller, we're actually going to configure our service API. So what this is doing is telling the commerce engine to actually include our service APIs when it's building up the OData model builder. So we're going to register a pipeline block in the iConfigure service API pipeline, and that's the part that lets it know what to do. So we are registering our entity, which is wishlist, and we're actually registering a couple of other methods. We've got here add wishlist line and remove wishlist line, and we're defining what command they are and how we should reference them within the builder. Okay, the next part we have to do is tell Sitecore about our plugin. So we're going to use configure Sitecore to help register our dependency injection. We're going to register our entities, components, pipelines, all of our pipeline blocks. And what we can do in here, in this example, we're going to register new functionality, but you can also use the configure Sitecore class to manipulate the pipelines and things that are defined in other plugins as well. So this is essentially where we tell it how to wire up all of that information. The commerce engine will actually automatically call this class, and we don't have to register calling the registration class somewhere. So you can see here in the first line, we're defining our wishlist we're defining our get wishlist pipeline and then adding in the get wishlist block. We're doing the same for the add wishlist line and remove wishlist line. Underneath that, we're configuring our service API block, and underneath that, we're doing another one, which is our register plugin block. The register plugin block is a little bit of a weird one. The code will mostly function without it, but what it does is it lets the commerce engine return metadata about the plugins that are installed in the system, and we'll take a look at how that appears after that as well. We're also registering all of the commands within the assembly. Okay. So we saw in there that we had a pipeline block for registering the plugin, and that registers a block within the iRunning plugins pipeline. If that's not a mouthful, I don't know what is. And it actually provides the commerce engine with details about our plugin, and as I said, it returns this information as metadata. So we've got here our register plugin block, and really it's just loading the assembly information into the system. Now, we've got all of our code pieces together. How are we actually going to deploy this? Now, one of the first things that confused me was I got all of my code written, and I was like, how on earth do I actually get the commerce engine to run this? What you actually need to do is you need to reference it. So plugins should be referenced by the commerce engine. They need to be referenced by the commerce engine, actually. And we can then customize our policy files for the environment and the role that we're using, and then we're going to bootstrap it. So bootstrapping is a little bit of a confusing one for some people. And you're like, bootstrapping? What is it? This doesn't have a front end at this stage. What are we talking about? So bootstrapping actually loads the environment configuration into the global database. It's they're JSON policy files, and for an individual plugin, they're actually stored in the database. Technically, you can actually remove the policy files after you've bootstrapped, but it makes it a little bit more difficult to see what's actually configured for your individual environment if the files are only located, if the development settings are only located within the database itself. Okay. After we've bootstrapped it, the next step to actually use our code is to generate the service proxy. Now, the service proxy is a generated assembly that's used to connect the engine to Sitecore. So it provides a proxy class that lets us interact with the functionality that we've created within the commerce engine. Now the SDK provides a project that allows you to regenerate this service proxy. Okay, now we're going to take a quick look at it in action. So what we've got is a few examples of how we can interact with the plugin. We're going to pretty much look at the first one today. We're going to take a look at Postman. We're going to execute our code through some OData APIs, and we're going to check out our requests and our responses. You can also use the console app, which helps simulate load within your plugin and executes a wide variety of data and scenarios. Again, the sample application is available within the SDK. On top of that, as a last step, you can look at your integration with Sitecore. All right then, so let's take a look at our plugin in action. Here, we've got Postman open. The first thing we're going to do is authenticate against the commerce engine. Without that, all of our requests are going to fail with 401. Okay, now the get token methods are available within the collection set provided through the Sitecore SDK, so you'll be able to see that there as well. Okay, we've authenticated. First thing we're going to do is check out our add wishlist line method. We can see the parameters that we're sending through within the body tab, and our token is going to be automatically sent through. So similar to the cart calls, our item ID is actually a combination of our catalog name, our product ID, and also the variant ID. This combination lets you add a specific size or color for the item that you're adding to the cart, but you could customize it to just add a generic item as well. Then we've got our get wishlist call here. We can see that there's a few extra things that come after the wishlists thing. We're passing in the ID of the wishlist that we're going to load, and we also want to make sure that we're expanding the associated components. So if you remember when we defined our entity, we added lines. Those lines were of type wishlist component. So we're actually going to expand that. So when we execute it, we will see that our response contains the line and the details of the line that we actually added. So that's how we can test out our code using Postman. The other thing that we can do is using a tool that's called Plumber. Now Plumber lets us check out the metadata that we've helped create and define within the Sitecore engine to see what's registered within our plugin, but also what's registered within other plugins. So we can see here, this is our list of all of the plugins that are actually defined within our commerce engine. So we can see Wishlist is our last one here. Now, this has got all of them, and it'll jump to a specific one. And we can see our commands. We've got get wishlist command, remove wishlist command, get wishlist command, and add wishlist command. We've got our wishlist entities. We've got our wishlist line components. I have added in a policy that kind of helps define whether or not we want to clean up our wishlist after a certain expiry time. And we also have a model for our wishlist line added. So as I said, through here you can actually investigate all of the different plugins that you have installed. So this is the metadata of those. We can also check out the pipelines. So we're going to take a look at our get wishlist pipeline. We can see where it starts, what blocks execute it, and where it ends. That'll also give us information on the inputs and outputs. So in our case, the resolve wishlist argument and also wishlist. So Plumber is a handy open source tool that lets you visually investigate the metadata. You can also call the metadata services through Postman as well, but the visual representation makes it a lot easier. Now we've gone through the basic parts that make a plugin. We're also going to look at how we can take things a little bit further. What other options do we have for extensibility? So the first big one that we've got is minions. So minions help us to run asynchronous tasks, okay, which means that we can execute things one-off or also on a schedule. So they're often used for importing data from a PIM, sending orders over to an ERP, or things along those lines. We can also create and extend entity views. Now, the entity views are what are constructed within the business tools. So extending the entity views lets us create ways for editors to interact with the new fields and properties that we may add. And then on top of that, you can also extend the business tools using the BizFX SDK. So there's a few extra options. What we've talked about here is going through sort of the simple part and really just getting a better understanding of all the different things that make up our plugins. Now, resources. Where can you go for help and what kind of things can you expect to find? So check out the e-commerce channel within the Sitecore Slack. There's a lot of people working on a lot of Sitecore Commerce projects at the moment, and there's a great variety of information available. On GitHub, you can also check out the Sitecore Habitat Home commerce example. This is a bit more of a fully fledged example, following the kind of the same habitat structure that we've seen in the other Sitecore 9 things. And then also Plumber SC is available on GitHub, and that's a tool that I was looking at just before, which helps give you a good visual representation. The source code for the plugin that we've gone through today is available on GitHub, and that contains the full plugin with all of the entities, models, pipelines, pipeline blocks for both the get functionality, but also things like transitioning the wish list to a cart and cleaning up abandoned or older wish lists and things like that as well. On top of that, I've also posted a series of blog posts that explain some of the individual concepts, things like how to debug, where can you find the extension points for your pipelines and things like that. So thanks everyone for joining me today, and have fun creating plugins.